I don't need to waste your time with tier one. We already know you're starting them. CeeDee Lamb, St. Brown, Jefferson, Chase, Rice. If you disagree with me, just let me know in the comments. Going over to tier two, honestly, you know to start these guys anyway, but I'll talk about them regardless. Nico Collins has been absolutely crushing, and I actually think it could get better for Nico. A wide receiver that the passing volume hasn't really been what we would expect in Houston, but he still is continuing to dominate as the alpha option here, where you have over 300 receiving yards through the first 3 weeks. He's only had one receiving touchdown, but as we've said a countless number of times now, I actually expect CJ Stroud to bump up the passing volume here very soon. Going over to our next name, we are going to be looking at Marvin Harrison Jr. Harrison's had back-to-back weeks with phenomenal performances. You have the best matchup that you could possibly ask for going up against the Washington Commanders, and also you may be in a situation in which Trey McBride misses. If McBride's out of this offense, I actually maybe would move Marvin Harrison Jr. up to tier one. He's had 19 targets over the past 2 weeks. He's had almost 200 receiving yards over the past 2 weeks, and he's had 3 receiving touchdowns. It is the best matchup imaginable. Now, going over to our next ranking, maybe this is a little bit too high, and I completely understand if you want to go to the comment section and scream at me for this. I will have Tyreek Hill here. Yes, Tyreek Hill was very disappointing last week. Yes, Tyreek Hill gave you 7 fantasy points last week. And yes, this quarterback play is either going to come down to Tyler Huntley, Tim Boyle, or Skylar Thompson. It's going to be a train wreck. As we already mentioned, we know to lower expectations with Achane, Waddle, and Tyreek, but we're moving Tyreek down from wide receiver 1 to wide receiver 8. I think it's kind of low enough, considering with Tyreek, you only need one big play to kind of get there. Now, this next ranking is probably going to be the reason you unsubscribe to this channel, and I'm not going to fault you for it. Brandon Ayuk. We all have Ayuk, Neighbors, and Davante Adams, all here as must-start receivers. Now, you can scream at me in the comment section that Neighbors should be ahead of Ayuk, and honestly, he probably should be. The point of these rankings is I'm trying to do my best to help you submit your starting lineup this week. I know everybody watching this already understands you want to start Malik Neighbors. Malik Neighbors has been absolutely dominant through the first 3 weeks. Neighbors has had a ridiculous 37 targets in this offense. Ridiculous. Now, I will say with Neighbors, going up against the Dallas Cowboys defense, historically, I don't want to say historically, at least this season, the better game plan against Dallas is actually to run the ball rather than air it out. I do think you could potentially have Daniel Jones come back down to earth just a bit, but regardless, you already know to start Malik Neighbors. I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page that we are starting Brandon Ayuk. With Ayuk, you potentially have no Deebo Samuel in this game and no George Kittle. While Jauan Jennings had absolutely everything last week, Brandon Ayuk still had 10 targets in this offense. The volume was still there against New England. Right now, sportsbooks are projecting out the San Francisco 49ers to be able to go out there and score about 25 points. So the offense will be good. Ayuk's still going to command a very high percentage of it, and I do believe that he is the wide receiver 1 here over Jauan Jennings for 120 million reasons. And then going over to Davante Adams as the last guy in this tier, we don't really know what the quarterback play is going to be like in Las Vegas. I will stand by. It's probably bad quarterback play overall, and it's a toughish matchup going up against the Cleveland Browns. So don't love going in the Adams direction. But now dropping down to our next tier, we will have Chris Godwin and Mike Evans back to back. With Godwin, he's averaging about 8.5 targets so far per game through the first 3. With Godwin, he's had over 250 receiving yards through the first 3 weeks. And with Godwin, he has scored a touchdown in every single game. Mike Evans, on the other hand, has not seen as much volume, where Mike Evans has only had 15 targets through the first 3 weeks. Mike Evans has not had the touchdown consistency. Mike Evans has only had 2 touchdowns through the first 3 weeks, while at the same time, Evans was horrendous against Denver this past week. Now, obviously, Evans is the wide receiver on the outside that drew Patrick Surtain, that had the very tough cornerback matchup, and that was my fault for not taking into account how much we should expect that to eat into Mike Evans and his overall target share, which clearly played out against the Broncos last week, actually only seeing a total of 3 targets in this offense. Going into the future, I still think that this is a wide receiver 1A, wide receiver 1B situation. I think that you are going to have some random spike weeks from Evans, and his touchdown rate should still be higher than the touchdown rate of Chris Godwin when it's all said and done. Now, going over to Chris Olave, we finally had the opportunity to see what Olave looked like in a close game against the Philadelphia Eagles this past week. You get 86 receiving yards for 6 receptions and the receiving touchdown. You get a cool 20 fantasy points. Now, to be honest with you, the target volume wasn't super exciting with Olave. You only had 6 targets, but here in this matchup going up against the Atlanta Falcons, it should be a fine spot. We've seen wide receiver ones against Atlanta find success this season. Going over to our next receiver with DK Metcalf, this is a spot that playing the Detroit Lions, you would naturally expect that we should actually have a ton of passing volume for the Seattle Seahawks here, where we have seen historically, at least through the first 3 weeks, that Detroit has one of the best rush defenses in the NFL. I made a massive mistake in ranking James Conner too high against this Detroit Lions defense this past week, but we have seen teams be able to find success throwing the ball. I expect the passing volume to be there for Metcalf. And honestly, I wouldn't mind if you wanted to go out there and take the pick'em for DK Metcalf to have a receiving touchdown. Right now, that's at a 1.3x multiplier on Underdog Fantasy. And if we go through and if we look at Metcalf to have a receiving touchdown, Amon-Ra St. Brown to have a receiving touchdown, and Geno Smith to have 245.5 passing yards in this game, we are actually able to get odds where if we put $10 down, that's to win 116. And because I expect this to be a game with a little more passing volume, I don't mind that whatsoever. Obviously, if the odds come down by the time you get to this, then definitely reevaluate. But if you wanted to check out any of those pick'ems, you can find that link to Underdog Fantasy in both the description and comment section. And if you use promo code FLOCK when you sign up to Underdog, you're going to be getting a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll be getting a free Patrick Mahomes pick, more than less than half a total yard for the Sunday night game, and an additional free pick on top of that if you're a new user with code FLOCK. If you sign up before the Thursday night game, that will be a Dak Prescott additional pick'em. But yeah, make sure you use the link in the description or comment section with code FLOCK so you can also get a free team review through flockfantasy.com. But let's move this over to our next guy, which will be DJ Moore. DJ Moore, this ranking is definitely subject to change because right now it looks like Keenan Allen may be playing this week. Now, obviously, if you have no Keenan Allen, DJ Moore would be more exciting in that you just really are only expecting 2 receivers here to have that consistent workload, and that would be Rome Odunze and Moore. And honestly, if you're looking at the underlying target volume with DJ Moore, it's been extremely consistent through the first 3 weeks here. DJ Moore has actually had 28 targets through the first 3 weeks, averaging over 9 targets a game. This matchup against the Rams, you actually have an implied team total of almost 22 points for the Chicago Bears. So it does appear to be a really good spot for DJ Moore, and maybe Rome Odunze we'll talk about later on. Now going over to Drake London. Looking at London, this is a receiver that has played almost 100% of the snaps for the Atlanta Falcons so far through the first 3 weeks. Every single week, we are seeing an expanded target share for Drake London in this offense. Week 1, you have 3 targets. Week 2, you have 7 targets. Week 3, we get 9 targets for Drake London here. And I know a lot of people are upset with us having Bijan Robinson, quote unquote, too high as a tier 1 running back. But if you're looking at the matchups that this Atlanta Falcons offense has dealt with through the first 3 weeks, you had them go up against the Steelers, the Eagles, and the Chiefs. Some of the toughest defensive matchups you were going to have this season. Going into the future, it should be much better for the Atlanta Falcons. And I'm actually in on buying on this Falcons bounce back. Now going over to Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson will be much higher in my rest of season rankings than he is in these. Garrett Wilson's a receiver that's averaging close to 9 targets per game, and an offense that we expect that there will be efficient quarterback play overall. But specifically this week, going up against the Denver Broncos, we have seen time and time again here that this is a situation in which the wide receiver ones disappoint. It's a very difficult spot to get excited when we have seen the wide receiver ones against this Denver team disappoint time and time again, similar to Mike Evans dropping 3 fantasy points last week. So I do think our rest of season rankings will look very different with Garrett Wilson. Our rest of season rankings, we have Garrett Wilson right up there alongside the other wide receiver ones, such as Malik Neighbors. I believe we have Neighbors wide receiver 10 in our rest of season ranks. Garrett Wilson wide receiver 11. Just this match up, I think you have to lower your expectations. Deontay Johnson will be our next receiver here. And Deontay Johnson through the first 3 weeks, we said you cannot start the guy. I'm very sorry about this past week where he goes out there and he absolutely dominates for the 122 receiving yards, the receiving touchdown off of 14 targets. Now going into this next game against the Cincinnati Bengals, we just saw Jaden Daniels have a fine performance against this defense, while at the same time, sportsbooks are projecting out the actual Panthers to be an okay offense with an applied team total currently at 21.5 points. And you have no Adam Thielen, so the target share should be expanded for Deontay Johnson as well. I think it is a very good spot for Deontay. Now, our next receiver will be Jauan Jennings. I think you have to say Jennings is a top 20 wide receiver based off what we had this past week. He goes out and he drops 46 points. This is the best week that we have seen from any player with any position in fantasy football this season. Now, I understand that most people are going to see this and go, okay, of course you rank him ahead of Brandon Ayuk this next week. And I completely understand the thought process, and I wouldn't fault you for doing so. But my thought process is I personally want to be going with the player that we have the larger sample of. If we go through and look at the entire career of Jauan Jennings, who is 27 years old, I am seeing one game in 2021 with over 20 fantasy points. I am seeing one game in 2024 with over 20 fantasy points, and that is it. So with Jennings, he is in a phenomenal situation in an offense that should be able to put points up easily. He is coming off the game of the year, but he's a 27-year-old receiver that through his entire NFL career, we have seen 2 games with over 20 fantasy points. I still think that you do start him here. Maybe I'm ranking him at wide receiver 20 because I'm a little nervous. I have to play against him in the flock league this week. But I still stand by. I think you probably want Ayuk over him. It would be very different if Jennings had like 18 targets and Brandon Ayuk only had 3 this past week. But I'm typically going to be going with the guy with the larger sample. Now, our next receiver is somebody that I am starting in the flock league this week. I'm a little bit worried that he actually may get scaled back a bit. I have Terry McLaurin in here, wide receiver 21. If you're looking at Terry McLaurin this past week, finally the deep ball that was there for Jayden Daniels. Jayden Daniels in prime time looks like one of the best quarterbacks that the NFL has this season as a rookie. Naturally, we're going to expect him to actually improve as his rookie season goes on. Now, to be fair with McLaurin, we've had a game with 3 points, a game with 8 points, and a game with 20 points. We're sitting with 18 targets this season, averaging 6 targets per game. So I really hope McLaurin outpaces this. You have a really high implied team total at 23 points going up against the Arizona Cardinals. This should be a high-scoring game overall. Now, going over to Amari, we are currently looking at a receiver that is averaging about 10 targets a game. Coming off a performance with 27 fantasy points, it's phenomenal. Obviously, 2 duds the first 2 weeks. But the in thing with Amari Cooper is this is a receiver that is going to be in one of the worst offenses in the NFL. If you look at the implied team total for the Cleveland Browns this week, going up against the Raiders, which should be an extremely low-scoring game overall, you do only have a 19.5 point total. So I'm a little bit worried that the overall passing volume may not be here in this Cleveland Browns offense, where this has been some of the least efficient quarterback play in the entire NFL. Now, going over to our next receiver, I took a lot of Stefon Diggs in underdog drafts, so I hope Diggs continues to come out here and absolutely dominate. He has looked phenomenal. With this being said, if you're looking at the underlying target volume that you've had from Stefon Diggs and Tank Dell, I actually do expect that the gap between these two receivers closes in just a bit in comparison to what it has been. Now, obviously, with Diggs, we're sitting here with a total of 24 targets through the first 3 weeks. So he is averaging 8 targets a game in an offense that I actually expect to be better going into the future with a massive implied team total this week going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. But I'm expecting just a little bit of a scale back if you're looking at the efficiency from a fantasy points per target perspective. Now, going over to T. Higgins was very disappointing his first week back in what was supposed to be a prime matchup going up against the Commanders. Obviously, Yoshi Vosh actually had the majority of the points here over Higgins. But going into the future, I mean, speaking of what we have with, say, like Jauan Jennings versus Brandon Ayuk, I am always one to lean with the player that has volume over a large sample on his size versus the option that is spiked with a little bit of a more limited workload. With that being said, if you're looking at the underdog pick'ems that you have this week, T. Higgins is right now higher, lower 53.5 receiving yards, which will be significantly higher than what you actually see from Yoshi Vosh. I still expect him to be the wide receiver 2 here in Cincinnati. Zay Flowers will be our next option. Obviously, Zay Flowers was extremely disappointing this past week. Going up against the Buffalo Bills, it's probably going to be a very different game environment, however. While yes, this is a tough matchup against a very good Bills defense, while at the same time, you're actually looking at the environment maybe being a little bit better for passing volume, where we go ahead and we look at Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson in a game against the Kansas City Chiefs where they trail pretty much the entire time, you see 41 pass attempts. In a game against the Raiders, which ends up being a close game at the very end, you see 34 pass attempts. In a game where they blow out the Dallas Cowboys, we actually only get 15 passing attempts and 182 passing yards from Lamar. But that shouldn't be the case against the Bills. Should definitely be a much closer game, but of course the Bills defense is much better here. Now, going over to our next receiver, we are going to be looking at George Pickens. Now, I stand by the issue that we've had with Pickens all year. If you're looking at the projected passing volume from a week-to-week perspective for Pittsburgh, it's going to be at the very bottom of the NFL. While Justin Fields himself can find success from a real-life perspective, playing smart football, not turning the ball over, maybe picking up rushing first downs when he needs to, this is still a team that is at the bottom of the NFL in both passing touchdowns and passing yards. Even if Pickens sees a higher percentage of this, it doesn't really matter, where Fields has had 156 passing yards, 117 passing yards, 245 passing yards. So he's averaging fewer than 200 passing yards a game, and he's only had 2 passing touchdowns in the first 3 weeks. Now, Tank Dell, on the other hand, is obviously a much smaller fish in a much bigger pond. I am expecting that CJ Stroud is going to very soon start putting up 300 passing yard performances. You can see this kind of with his underdog projected pick'ems. You can see this at the same time with an implied team total of 26 points for this Houston Texans offense. Well, yes, Tank Dell has been very bad through the first 3 weeks. And to be honest with you, I don't have Tank Dell anywhere, so I hope he doesn't perform. At the same time, the target volume's been there. He's had 17 targets through the first 3 weeks here. So you are pretty much seeing about 6 targets a game for Tank Dell in what we expect to be a much better offense going into the future. And he is running almost as many routes as what you have from Stephon Diggs and Nico Collins. Now going over to Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed very easily can move up these rankings. Now, of course, I'm going to be updating the rankings on flockfantasy.com pretty much every single day leading up till kickoff. So if we officially get word that Jordan Love is back under center, you're probably going to see Jayden Reed fly up these ranks, but I want to be a little bit hesitant and just put a disclaimer. If Love starts, you probably want to start Jayden Reed, even though it's a tough matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. If Love misses, then obviously Jayden Reed is a player that you have to have on your bench. And going over to Jackson Smith-Njigba. Like we've discussed, if you look at that PFF chart of his snap percentages through his NFL career, he has set a new career high every single week over the past 3 weeks. You have a dud week in week 1, a dud week in week 3. Week 2 was great against the Pats in a game where they actually have to throw the ball aggressively to try to keep up. You have 16 targets in that contest. Now, obviously, for taking a step backwards, the man has only had 21 targets so far this year, only averaging 7 targets a game. But going up against the Detroit Lions is actually probably a spot where you see a lot of passing volume in this offense. Now, going over to what we have with Calvin Ridley. The Ridley snap rate actually fell down dramatically this past week, where you actually only saw 72% of the snaps as we had a little more DeAndre Hopkins get involved. We also saw the targets fall for Calvin Ridley down to 3 against the Green Bay Packers. Should be a very low scoring game environment as well. So far, Ridley has only had 16 targets so far through the first 3 weeks, and Hopkins is probably going to continue to expand his role as the season goes on. Now, Rome Odunze, massive blow-up spot this past week with the 11 targets, the receiving touchdown, and the 112 receiving yards. Now, with that being said, it was in a game where Caleb Williams had 50-plus pass attempts. With that being said, it was in a game with no Keenan Allen. So if Keenan Allen is active, I think we want to be a little bit more hesitant on Rome Odunze. But obviously, if Keenan Allen does miss, especially in a game against the Rams, Rome is somebody that you just absolutely have to start at that point. Now, going over to Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle was a must-bench guy for us last week. Probably remains as a must-bench guy for us this week. At the very best, you're just considering him for the flex here. It's a brutal game environment with either Tyler Huntley, Tim Boyle, or Skylar Thompson under center. But similar to what we said with Tyreek Hill, really you only need one big play to happen to all of a sudden see one of these receivers be viable options. Now, Jameson Williams will be our next option. Jameson, came pretty damn close to just laying a complete goose egg this past week. But this is what we talked about with Jameson, right? You are going to see the high highs, you're going to see the low lows as a field stretching wide receiver that is going to rely upon big plays. Now, yes, he tricked a lot of people into thinking that he was going to be some target hog back in week 2 when you did see 11 targets in this offense against the Bucs, but that was more of a function of Jared Goff having 50 plus pass attempts, which is most likely not going to be the case going into the future. Obviously, he's a receiver with a crazy ceiling and a very good offense and always in consideration for a flex play, but you just have to understand that the range of outcomes will be extremely wide. Now, going over to Khalil Shakir, he continues to crush in this offense. The efficiency's through the roof. 14 yards per reception week 1, over 10 yards per reception week 2, 12 yards per reception in week 3. He's had 2 touchdowns through the first 3 weeks. Now, with all that being said, you're also sitting with only a total of 14 targets. So you have 2 touchdowns off of 14 targets. So we are scoring a touchdown every 7 targets we have for Shakir, which this will most likely come down dramatically. Now, obviously, you're in a very good offense. You're in a game against the Ravens that you're most likely going to have to see a bunch of pass attempts in Buffalo. Now, I will say, if you're looking at Keon Coleman, we'll talk about in just 1 second. Keon was in the doghouse, which is why you had no snaps for Keon Coleman in the first quarter of this past game. And honestly, it's probably going to swing in the other direction going into the future. Now, Xavier Worthy will be our next player here. With Worthy, I know we set a sell high on him after week 1, after the massive 20-point game for the NFL debut. But honestly, as I've said now, I think that he's a completely fine guy to go after. This is a receiver that has no Hollywood Brown in this offense, so he's only competing with Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce. There is that outside chance that all of a sudden we actually see the passing volume go up here for the Chiefs if they decide that, maybe the rushing efficiency isn't there without Isaiah Pacheco. So Worthy, definitely a very much boom bust receiver and a good offense that we are relying on a touchdown from. But I would say that's probably the same thing with Shakir. I'd say it's probably the same thing with Jameson Williams, which is why they're in the same tier. Michael Pittman Jr. will be our next guy. With Pittman, he is yet to crack 8 fantasy points. It is a tough scene. He's had 20 targets through the first 3 weeks. So the targets are there. But at the same time, this is a situation in which you do not have any consistency with the quarterback play with Anthony Richardson. It's so hard to project what the passing volume is going to look like. Anthony Richardson has no short field accuracy. And it's a very tough matchup going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Plus, you have Josh Downs coming in, and Josh Downs actually seeing the same amount of targets as Pittman this past week. Now, going over and looking at Rashid Shaheed, obviously we got yelled at last week for ranking him too low, but I will stand by. Very similar to what we said with Jameson Williams. He's a field stretching option that when he hits, he's going to hit in a big time way. You're going to get the long receiving touchdown. Through the first 2 weeks, he was averaging over 24 yards per reception, and he had 2 receiving touchdowns off of 9 targets. Now, that was extremely unsustainable. Is he going to have 0-point games going into the future? Probably not. Now, going over to our next receiver, we are going to be looking at Brian Thomas Jr. You've had the decline over the past 3 weeks, down from 14 to 11 to 9 points. Going up against Houston, this will probably be another spot where we see a ton of Trevor Lawrence pass attempts, where they are going to be trailing. They are about touchdown dogs. But at the same time, the efficiency hasn't been there. We'll throw Christian Kirk right here as well. I'll say you're probably a little more excited about these receivers if you have no Evan Ingram again this week. But if Evan Ingram does play, then at that point you have added target competition in an offense where we already don't really want anything to do with it. Now going over to Tyler Lockett. I pretty much thought Lockett was not going to be worth a roster spot after week 2, where you only see 2 targets with the full-blown JSN breakout. But this past week, you actually have 8 Tyler Lockett targets. It's an okay matchup going up against the Detroit Lions. Obviously, I'm not excited about him. I'm not excited about any of the receivers in this tier unless you really have to go through and start them. Cortland Sutton's going to see a ton of targets in a very bad offense in Denver. Yoshi Vosh is obviously just looking so damn good in Cincinnati, but I still do project him to be the 3rd passing option here at best. Keon Coleman, the snaps dip, but obviously a lot of that was due to do with the discipline of him showing up late, so he didn't play the first quarter. Jordan Addison is a receiver that's coming off an injury. We don't know exactly what to expect his first week back in. And DeAndre Hopkins is going to be playing in one of the lowest scoring game environments of this week. Still not playing a ton of snaps, but obviously expanding his role here. And Hopkins will probably continue to move up these rankings if we get another week similar to what we just had. But I think that's all I got for you. I really hope that we were able to help you out here. I really hope you're able to get something from it. Of course, if you wanted to go out there and check out any of those pick'ems, like I said, the pick'em slip that I made for today was for Metcalf and Amon-Ra St. Brown to both score touchdowns. Geno to have at least 245.5 passing yards. That was $10 to win 116. You can find that link to Underdog Fantasy in the description, in the comment section. Using promo code FLOCK, you will get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. You will get a free team review over there on flockfantasy.com. A Patrick Mahomes free pick, more than less than half a total yard. A Dak Prescott free pick, more than less than half a total yard on top of it. Just make sure if you wanted that free team review, you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your Underdog account. That way I'm able to go ahead and that way I'm able to accredit your account with that free team review voucher. But I think that's all I have for you. I really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day and hope I get to hang out with you after the game tonight.